Here we go. Hey guys, I'm really fortunate today, and this is the first of many interesting, great people that I've been very fortunate to get to know and meet. And it's my good friend Keith Idec. Keith has been a boxing writer for how many years now, Keith?
Boy, I've covered boxing since basically late 1996. So however,
Yeah.
what was that, 25, 26 years, whatever? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not good at math, but that sounds about right.
We're close, you know?
Yeah. And Keith and I have known each other, well, through boxing, but, you know, we're both local New Jersey guys. We know all the same people in amateur boxing, a lot of the same people in professional boxing. And some of the trainers that we know, like Joe Greer, who I grew up with, and Keith and I have nothing but high regard and respect for Joe.
Of course.
And a lot of the same fighters, good, bad, and indifferent, right, Keith, over the years, right?
We've seen all of them, you know, from the highest level to the lowest level.
Yes, we have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Keith also, when my son was fighting, I can't believe it's been coming up on 10 years already since his last fight. 11 years, or I'm sorry, 9 years. Like I said, math isn't my wheelhouse, but Keith was very kind and was able to kind of follow Sean a little bit and write some nice articles about him. And so you just got back from Atlanta for the Gervonta Davis and Barrios fight, and I watched that fight. And what was your take on it, Keith?
Well, you know, I think the end result, Mark, was probably what everyone expected, that Gervonta Davis was going to knock out Mario Barrios, who's a big, strong, tough kid.
Right.
You know, once Davis figured out his range, and it took him a few rounds to do that because he's so much smaller and has such a lesser reach. Once he figured out how to get inside on Barrios, you know, he pretty much took control of the fight. I thought two of the judges had it even through 6 rounds. 2 judges had it 57-57. That's about right, I thought, because there were a few rounds in the beginning of the fight where Davis didn't do much, and he was pretty cautious because I think he realized that he was in there with a big, strong guy. You know, probably they only listed the height advantage at about 4.5 inches. It sure looked like a lot more than that to me, you know, and he definitely had a huge reach edge. Probably, if I had to guess, probably outweighed Gervonta Davis by about 10 pounds in the ring. So those are a lot of disadvantages for a small guy coming up 2 weight classes. An impressive performance from Gervonta Davis. You know, he took a lot of criticism, Mark, because they kind of looked at, I mean, it's hard to say that a guy who's 26-0 with 17 knockouts, and yes, his title was a secondary BS title that shouldn't even exist, but he was technically a world champion. He had never lost. And, you know, while not on Gervonta Davis's skill level, clearly a very good fighter, probably like a B+ level fighter. And he knocked him out, and he knocked him down 3 times, stopped him in the 11th round. I mean, I don't know what people want to see him fight all the lightweights, you know, the elite lightweights and his rivals, which I completely understand because I want to see those fights, and I'm sure you do too. But an impressive performance overall from Gervonta Davis.
So you mentioned the reach advantage and the height advantage. My take on it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my thing is sometimes that height advantage could be a disadvantage in terms of you have to punch down. So when you're punching down, your hands are coming down from your guard. And then, especially when you're fighting a southpaw, then he can come over the top with a hook, you know, off your jab or even if you're going to the body. And the other thing I noticed about Barrios, he had a tight guard, and he didn't keep that jab out there and keep Davis at a distance where he was at that advantage. He allowed Davis, and once Davis felt that he could get inside and be comfortable there, I think that height and reach, he didn't use the reach, and the height maybe would have been a disadvantage in some respects to him.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mark. And that's something that he has not done in previous fights, using his height and reach to his advantage. He's actually fought smaller than his height would indicate that he should. And that probably is part of the reason why they picked him as the opponent, because his height and reach advantages look incredible on paper. He doesn't fight tall, you know. So, and the interesting thing you said in the beginning of what you were saying there, Mark, is that you can come over the top with the hook. And Gervonta Davis really did not do that in the first probably 7 rounds of the fight. And his trainer eventually told him, Calvin Ford told him, he's there for the hook. Throw the right hook. And that's what he did in the 8th round. And that's the punch that first knocked down Mario Barrios and completely changed the course of the fight.
Correct.
And man, he lifted him off his feet damn near with that right hook and knocked him down. So yeah, I mean, that was there for him. And Mario Barrios is not a good inside fighter either. So once Tank got inside on him, it was his fight to do what he wanted with.
It was his playing field. Yeah.
Yeah. Very much,
So where does Davis go from here, do you think? What's it, logical next step for him?
I think he's frustrating to boxing fans in some sense. Now, his fan base doesn't really care who he fights because, as Leonard Ellerbe, the CEO of Mayweather Promotions, told me after the fight, he said, look, there were 16,570 people in the building tonight, and probably 70 of them out of the 16,570 even know who Josh Taylor is. Now, we well know Josh Taylor is the undefeated, undisputed junior welterweight champion. I would love to see Gervonta Davis fight him. He's not going to. He's going to go back. I just think this was kind of a one-off. Eventually, I do think Gervonta Davis will settle in at 140 pounds. There are people that think he's going to go up to welterweight. He's a pretty small kid. I mean, he's
5'5" and a half, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously not tall. You've known me a long time, Mark, but he's shorter than me. I mean, he's not a big guy at all. So welterweight might be too high and too much of an ask for him. But I think he'll eventually settle in at 140 as he gets older. But at 26, he'll still make 35 comfortably. And I don't know that one of those big fights, meaning, and when I say big fights, I mean, of course, Teofimo Lopez, Devin Haney, or Ryan Garcia, which might be the biggest of all from a marketing standpoint, from a commercial standpoint. Yeah. I don't know that any of those three fights are going to happen next. And that is going to frustrate people because those are the types of opponents that they want to see Gervonta Davis fight. But as you well know, we lived it for decades. Floyd Mayweather is going to match this kid in a way that they see fit. They're going to exactly. The kid's making a lot of money. He's already a pay-per-view fighter. He's selling more tickets at the gate than any fighter other than Canelo Alvarez in American boxing, and that's really saying something. So, and he's done it in multiple cities. The kid's an attraction. So, his doubters and detractors, yes, they want to see him fight the best guys at lightweight, but that probably, however frustrating it might become, is probably not going to happen next.
What do you think the possibilities of him fighting Lomo, and then whoever wins that fight, then Lopez has to fight that whoever the winner would be?
I'd like to be optimistic. He's not fighting Lomachenko next, or maybe ever. So
why would that be? Is that more on Lomo's end?
No, I think it's more on their end. Although I think Lomo really wants the Lopez rematch, and I think that's particularly based on how Lomachenko looked against Nakatani on Saturday night. I think the rematch is very sellable now. But Teofimo Lopez hates Lomachenko, like literally hate. I mean, damn near hates him, right? So I don't think he's going to give him the opportunity unless it makes sense monetarily, where he's the champion. He won the first fight. So unless he gets a huge purse split in his favor, I'm talking like 75-25 or something like that. I don't think that fight's going to happen either. But as it relates to Tank Davis fighting Lomachenko, right now, based on Lomachenko losing the Lopez fight and being a little older, I do think that they view it as a high-risk, lower-reward type of fight for Tank Davis. And as Leonard Ellerbe and Floyd Mayweather said, he's selling out arenas fighting guys like Mario Barrios, so they don't necessarily have to take that type of fight now.
What's the hatred on Lopez's end for Lomo?
He thinks he's a very arrogant person. He did not like some of the things that Lomachenko said about him and his dad also in the build-up toward their fight, and even before the fight even became official. I mean, he really dislikes him. He knows now that he has all the leverage, whereas before,
Lomo did.
Here's the biggest mistake I think, Mark, that Lomachenko and his management made. They should have demanded that there was a rematch clause in that contract.
In the contract, yeah.
And frankly, it was bad business to not get that clause in the contract because anything can happen in boxing, as we well know.
I think they were overconfident going into the fight.
Completely think they were overconfident. I even asked Igis Klimas, who is Lomachenko's manager, like 2 days before I was out there for the fight in Vegas, and I asked him, I said, do you have a rematch clause? And he basically gave me a pretty dismissive answer as if, no, we don't have like it was almost unnecessary. Well, was it a good idea now?
Here you go. Yeah.
You know, now
So
you're begging for a
the
rematch.
arrogance, so I think if you're not arrogant in the boxing business, probably not a good thing.
Right, but in this case, it's just
Too
bad
much.
business. It's
Yeah,
bad business, and
yeah.
now you're in a position where you can't get the fight that you want.
Yeah.
Lopez is not going to fight at 135 pounds much longer, and he's looking at it like he wants to fight. You know, he says he wants to fight Devin Haney,
Mhm.
and I think he does. I mean, Lopez will fight anybody. I think, and he proved that by fighting Lomachenko. But he would rather fight Devin Haney or Gervonta Davis, one of his contemporaries, instead of going backward and fighting Lomachenko again, because in my opinion, there's only one way for him to go in fighting Lomachenko, and that's backward, because
Right.
he already
Yeah.
beat him.
Beat him
And
once.
as you mentioned to me earlier, Mark, you know, that fight turned into a very close fight in the second half.
Mhm.
Once Lomachenko started fighting, it became a competitive fight.
I think he
And
hurt him too. I forget what round toward the end.
yeah, maybe.
I think he wobbled him.
Yeah.
So the Devin Haney Linares fight. What was your take on that, Keith?
Well, the one takeaway I think that everyone had is at the end of the 10th round, Linares clipped Devin Haney with a shot that hurt him. And
Yeah.
you know, he fought on the. Some people are, I think, exaggerating a little bit with how much he was in survival mode in the 11th and 12th rounds, because there were points when he was throwing hard punches back at Linares. But it was definitely an eye opener in the sense that we had not seen Devin Haney in a fight, hurt in a fight.
Mhm.
But I thought that he showed well coming back from it and surviving it. You know, and he clearly won the fight.
Yeah.
But now there's some vulnerability that's evident in Devin Haney that's going to make people want to fight him more. I think, you know, Lopez always wanted to fight him. I think Gervonta Davis gladly would have fought him. But I think now they see him maybe as a more beatable fighter. And he's not while a skilled guy, clearly not the biggest puncher. And I think maybe they may see him as the easier mark among those four lightweights, you know, Gervonta Davis, Teofimo Lopez, Ryan Garcia, and him. He might be viewed as the easiest mark. I'm not saying he's not better than Ryan Garcia, but because he showed this vulnerability with getting hurt, I think people are going to want to fight him. But he might price himself out of those fights because he's been paid a lot of money by DAZN and Eddie Hearn for lesser fights. And now if he's going to fight Lopez, Davis, Garcia, he's going to be he's going to want an enormous sum of money. And is it worth it? I don't know.
Where does Ryan Garcia, where does he fit into this whole mix? I mean, I'm not so sure. I don't know. You know, he hasn't really faced any pedigree like Lopez has with Lomachenko, or like a fighter like Linares, or, you know, where do you think he fits into that group?
You know, the Luke Campbell win was very impressive. You know, Luke Campbell has basically lost all of his big fights, but he's an Olympic gold medalist, a very talented guy, you know, probably a top 8 lightweight in the world. And he did get off the deck and beat him. So that win was very impressive. There were constructive conversations, I guess would be the best way to put it, between Gervonta Davis's camp and Ryan Garcia's camp after Garcia beat Campbell. They were seriously talking about making that fight. And then Garcia's people went in the direction of trying to fight Manny Pacquiao, which was never realistic. The money was never there for that fight. And then, of course, Ryan Garcia has now had some mental issues that he has stepped away from training for a while. And he had a fight scheduled with Javier Fortuna for next Friday night, and he pulled out of it about a week and a half after it was announced. So it's kind of hard to say where Ryan Garcia is from a mental standpoint at this
Where is that coming from? What's that all about?
I don't. He just he's been open about his mental health issues in the past, about having some anxiety issues, some depression issues, and those are obviously very serious things. So you just have to give he's 22 years old still. You have to give him time to figure this stuff out. He's a very talented kid, and of course has a lot of crossover appeal with all this social media influence and everything. So. You just hope he gets it together, you know, for the sake of him and his family to get back in the ring, because what he showed in January against Luke Campbell was very promising. And I think, you know, a lot of these guys are very ambitious at young ages, and they want these tough fights. And you don't want to see them rushed into those fights necessarily, but I think they've been built in a way where they're all ready for those kinds of challenges. And you would hope they would happen sooner than later. But with Ryan Garcia in particular, out of those 4 guys, I just think it's almost impossible to say where he is right now, because he really did take a step back from his career to reassess where he is in his personal life. And until he comes back from that and maybe has some sort of tune-up fight or whatever, I think it's really tough to say where he's going to go and how soon.
You know, the social media thing is interesting to me because, you know, in the other sport that I'm heavily involved in professional hockey, it's changed the dynamic where I've heard stories where guys after a game will go and they're sitting in their locker room checking their social media to see what kind of feedback they're getting from their followers on their performance in the game.
Right.
What do you think the impact has been for a guy like Garcia, who really was an IG star before he became, you know, until he really got some traction professionally in terms of his fighting?
You know, for old guys like us, Mark, we don't quite get how people live on social media all day, every day, and it can really have a negative impact on someone's
Psyche,
self-worth. Right? Yeah, your psyche, your self-worth, and everything. And if you're constantly looking for that affirmation on social media, it can be man, it's a cesspool out there, and it's just you can't, you know, and then the things that people say, you know, anonymity is quite a powerful drug, isn't it? I mean, because people just go on there and say whatever, and that you certainly wouldn't say to someone to their face, or if your name was even attached to it, because if you have a real job or anything, you can't go on there and say whatever you want to people. And it's kind of, for lack of a better word, scummy. You know, it really, I just don't, you know, but we're from a different generation, and we're, you know, I've fallen into it sometimes just on Twitter, and I can see how you can, you know, you start going back and forth with somebody, and it's like, why are you arguing with someone who doesn't even identify themselves? Why are you wasting your time doing that? And I learned that in the beginning, and now I just don't do it anymore, really, you know? So, but again, if you're a young person and this is what you've known since you were young, it's much more difficult to turn it off. And I think maybe that's part, in particular with Garcia, I think maybe that's part of what he's learning, to not, you know, to actually live and enjoy your life, as opposed to having to broadcast every single thing that you're doing at all times. It's just like, that's just not a way to live, really. You know,
I sometimes think, as it relates to him in particular, some of the stuff he was doing with the fast hands and all that, some of the old timers, I'm considered an old timer now, sit back and go, all right, that's nice, but what can you do in the ring? You know, and you kind of almost get a negative opinion of somebody because you go, okay, you know, that's a little bit showy. You know, what are you really about? So I think that, like you said, that could work against you. No matter what you put out there, you're going to get a certain percentage of very negative comments. Right. And if you take it to heart, it's going to screw your head up. You know, it's a lot of self-doubt.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Mark. And it is like, you try to be sensitive toward what people are going through, of course, from a mental standpoint and an emotional standpoint. But it's almost like you're asking for it to some degree when you're constantly
putting yourself
looking for this positive feedback from people all day, every day. You just turn it off and just, well, in his case, I mean, he really did build himself into a brand before he had ever fought anyone of consequence, really. But then he showed well against Luke Campbell, you know what I mean? So, I mean, he proved that he could beat a top level guy. Now, the elite level guys, I'm not sure that he can beat, but, you know, I just going back to what your original question was, I just wish some of these younger guys would leave social media alone a little bit. And I mean, it's entertaining. I mean, and from the standpoint of the website that I work for, you know, readers eat that type of stuff up. So if someone goes on there and says so-and-so is a blah, blah, you know, whatever these crazy things that they say about each other, I mean, it generates traffic and it generates interest. But just to be on there at all times, every day, I just think you're kind of, it's a false sense of who you are, maybe to some degree. And it's just not it's like an alternate universe to some degree. And just, and really, I think sometimes people get lost in, you know, some of the feedback on social media. I mean, if you're on social media all day, every day, look, people have real jobs and they're doing like a million, you have kids and whatever else, you know, the things that are actually important. It's a small faction of people. It's not really, like, if you have 1 million followers, there are not 1 million people on there all day, every day, paying attention to every little thing that you say. I mean, some of them might check in once every 2 weeks or something, but people make it seem like there are
It's
millions of
instant.
people just waiting for every single thing.
Your next
Oh,
word.
I had breakfast this morning and whatever. I mean, if you have anything positive or constructive to do, you're not waiting for that message every day
Right.
from Ryan Garcia or anyone else, you know?
So we talked briefly before we got on here about I mean, it's changing now because the COVID restrictions are loosening up, but we were kind of starting a discussion on how maybe not having fans affected the fighters, especially the big title fights. What's your take on it, Keith?
Well, almost to a man, every fighter said the same thing. I just treat it like sparring. It's not going to affect me much. I think in certain cases it's BS. You know, I do think some of them were affected by it because they feed off the energy of the crowd,
Sure.
Especially the showmen, you know, like the guys who really enjoy and they play to the crowd and everything. I think it did impact them to some extent. But what choice do they have, right? I mean, you're either going to get a big payday. In the case of Teofimo Lopez and Vasily Lomachenko, excuse me, they were paid in total about $5 million altogether to fight in front of me and about 55 other people in the building that night. There was no one there. I mean, at the MGM Grand Conference Center, and that's a shame because that type of fight would have drawn such a big crowd to Madison Square Garden. It would have been an incredible atmosphere and everything. And that was just the reality of where we were in October with the pandemic. So, guys did it because they had to, but.
As a writer, what impact did it have on you?
Not really any,
Nothing
to be
really.
honest. It was quieter.
You need to focus more a little bit.
It was quieter. You didn't have people throwing things sometimes or whatever, whatever. But I mean, we're pretty secure in the media section, of course. I mean, they don't just let anyone wander in there. But you have a tendency when you've been doing this for a long time, of course, Mark, said, you get in these environments where sometimes it's really crazy. I mean, and you just put your blinders on, you just block it all out. And it's just, you don't even know where you are sometimes. You just kind of focus on what you're doing because you can't, one thing I try to do, because sometimes I think when you have tunnel vision or you're just doing your job day to day and whatever, you don't appreciate sometimes where you are, but sometimes I just try to look around and like when you're at Madison Square Garden and it's sold out or somewhere incredible like that, you just kind of look around and you say, oh man, this is amazing, and then you do that for about 2 or 3 seconds and then you get right back to work. But you tend not to let that kind of stuff, you just block it out basically. But
so before we got on, we were just briefly discussing David Morrell, who I didn't really know anything about. And I watched him Sunday on Fox and I was super impressed. Mm-hmm. Not so sure what the level of talent he was up against in that fight. You would know better than I, but I was just really impressed by the kid. Strong for sure.
Yeah, no, he's only 23 years old, whereas most Cubans, when they come here, they're much older. Right. Not only are they much older, we can never really baseball. Right, yeah, exactly. They're in the Little League World Series and then they fight the next week. But you're never really sure how old they actually are. I mean, there are people who think Luis Ortiz, who was listed as 41 years old, is actually 51. Now, it's probably somewhere in the middle. But the amazing thing with David Morrell Jr. is he is 23 years old and far from a finished product. And man, is this kid talented. He's big, he's strong, he's technically sound, explosive. What he did to Mario Cazares the other night was he was expected to win the fight. He was not expected to blow him out with, in effect, one punch in the first round. I mean, Cazares had beaten now, I don't know what this means anymore, but he had beaten Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in his previous fight, in which Cazares was a huge underdog. I think he was 11-0 going into that fight, but he had fought no one. I mean, he had cab drivers and whatever down in Mexico, and he was 30 years old already. So it was kind of like, why hasn't he fought anyone decent at this point? Right. And the fight ended on a cut, so he won a technical decision against Chavez, but he was well on his way to winning maybe even stopping Chavez because he was laying it on him pretty good. And Chavez has a tendency to fold in fights and quits and things like that. So that might have been on its way to happening. But I think coming into this fight, Morrell was clearly the favorite. But, the fight was expected to go rounds. Cazares had never lost before and is coming off of the biggest win of his career. And for him to just go in there and blow him out that way, I mean, that was a real statement that Morrell sent to the super middleweight division. Yeah.
What I really he smelled blood. He knew he hurt him,
Yeah.
and he just went right back in and just threw another straight left hand and ended it. So
Yeah.
it was very impressive.
Mhm.
So I guess the next big fight's coming up, Pacquiao and Spence, right?
Well, that's the second next big one, I guess, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
The Wilder Fury third fight is July 24th, so that's the
That's right.
next.
Yeah.
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 I mean, there's another very interesting fight that's on the calendar the week before the third Wilder Fury fight. It's Jermell Charlo against Brian Castano. Most people are not, overly familiar with Brian Castano, but he's the WBO junior middleweight champion. And both fighters are Charlo actually lost to Harrison.
Right. Yeah.
Castano is undefeated. He has a draw on his record. Some people think he beat Arizlandi Lara, who you're, I know, very familiar with. But that's the draw on his record. So it's for all of the junior middleweight titles, and it'll crown the first fully unified champion in the division in the four belt era. So it's a pretty big fight on Showtime July 17th. Not nearly as big as Wilder Fury, but it's a big fight
it's
on
an
the 17th.
fight.
Yeah. And then Wilder Fury, which of course
is an interesting guy too, right? I mean,
Mhm.
he still maintains his relevance. Lara.
Yeah, and his last fight against a fighter we're very familiar with, Thomas Lamanna from South Jersey. He blew him out in the first round knockout. He was a heavy favorite to win that fight, but he's still a very talented guy. And I think Lara he's listed as 38 years old. And again, I go back to what we've said about the Cuban fighters. You don't really know how old he is.
You don't know how old he is.
Right. He's listed as 41 now. So Rigondeaux. Yeah. So, but yeah, so Lara's, he doesn't have the legs that he once had, but he's still a very technically sound fighter. And he's going to give give top guys fits, even though he doesn't move as well as he once did, because he's so smart and he's so skillful. He's going to give a lot of guys problems. And I think, he still wants to fight for a few more years. So I think we'll see him in high level fights before he's done here.
So Tyson Fury and Wilder, what's the relevance of this fight in terms of where the heavyweight division is right now? It's kind of a mixed mess, isn't it? A little bit.
Yeah. Well, of course, everyone thought, and I'm not really sure why, because in my opinion, Wilder had an ironclad contract for the third fight, and I didn't quite understand how he was just going to get skipped over. And it turned out he was not skipped over because an arbitrator ruled in his favor, and rightfully so, I think. A lot of people were hyped up for the Joshua Fury fight, and understandably so. But Wilder deserves this third fight contractually. Look, he made a lot of excuses after the second fight. I mean, maybe more excuses than I've ever heard after a person losing in a boxing match. I mean, from the costume to Tyson Fury loading his gloves to Mark Breland conspiring with the other corner. It was like every day he had a new one. More absurd excuse than the day before. Yeah. Not a good reflection on Wilder, unfortunately, who I actually like. I mean, I just think he went off the deep end when he suffered his first loss and didn't know how to deal with it. The one thing I would say to people, though, Mark, who are just counting him out in this fight, is he is the most devastating puncher in boxing still. Clear, one of the most pulverizing punchers in the history of the sport. Yeah. So I don't know how you just discount a guy like that when he could be down 9 rounds to nothing against Tyson Fury and knock him cold.
Take him out. Yeah.
He already knocked him down twice in the first fight. The second fight was clearly the worst performance of Deontay Wilder's career. The thing that I wonder about most is, from a psychological standpoint, can he overcome the beating that he took from Tyson Fury in that first fight? And that's what July 24th is all about, really.
Pacquiao Spence, I guess I wonder how much residual damage Spence has still from the car accident. And Pacquiao, how much longer can he go?
I'm a little concerned, honestly, Mark, about Pacquiao in this fight, because I think Errol Spence showed against Danny Garcia that he is the same fighter before the car accident, that was a legitimate question going into the Garcia fight. I mean, how could anyone say with any certainty that Errol Spence would still be Errol Spence before you saw it? But he beat. I thought Danny Garcia played that fight too cautiously. I think there were times when he could have fought Spence a little more and maybe pressed him a little more to try to win. But Errol Spence, he was rusty, but he won the fight very easily against Danny Garcia, who's a top level welterweight. So he's coming off that win where there didn't seem to be any residual effects from the car accident. And Pacquiao he looked very good against a 30-year-old undefeated welterweight champion in Keith Thurman. But he's now 2 years older. He's 42 years old. He has not fought since he fought Thurman, which is now, by the time he gets in the ring with Errol Spence, 25 months will have gone by from the time he fought Keith Thurman. So that level of activity combined with his age, combined with that Errol Spence is a beast.
Yeah.
I don't like this fight. Look, people have counted Manny Pacquiao out many, many times, and we've all been wrong about that.
Right.
This might just be one step too far, in my opinion, for him.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, you have the age factor, the strength factor, because he's really a smaller man. And Spence is strong. He's a strong guy.
Yeah.
And
a tough kid, obviously a tough kid, Yeah, so, I'm a little nervous about that just from you just don't want to see a guy who's meant so much for the sport in Manny Pacquiao. And also who means, let's forget boxing for a second, what he means to the Filipino people moving forward. He might if someone would have told us this 15 years ago, we would have laughed in their face. But Manny Pacquiao might very well become the president of the Philippines.
Correct.
I mean, imagine if someone said to you, well, I think Floyd Mayweather is going to become the president of the United States. I mean, it's a country of near 100 million people, and he might become the president. So he, from a personal standpoint, outside of boxing, he means so much to those people. Even if he just remains a senator or an ambassador to the Filipino people, he's so much more important to them outside of the boxing ring than he is inside it. And you just don't want to see him, get hurt or have any permanent damage from a fight like this.
100%. Switching over to the amateur side of things right now, Keith. Obviously, we just lost a year at least of amateur boxing. What's the impact going to be on those guys that were just developing and had a year where they couldn't fight? And now, the Olympic program and also just like prospects for professional fighting. I have to feel that there was kind of a substantial impact on amateur boxing.
Yeah, it really did. It had quite an impact, Mark. And I think the younger guys will be able to overcome it much more so than the guys who now – think about the guys who were going to fight in the Olympics last year, and some of them just turned pro instead. Now, a few of them have come back and are now going to fight in the Olympics from the American standpoint. It just stinks, though, that, a kid would work his whole life. And you know how it goes in the boxing business. It's very tempting to take the money, to take a signing bonus and get started with your pro career. And these guys sacrifice so much. And then you get to the point where you're going to go fight in the Olympics, and then a worldwide pandemic happens, and the world is shut down, and you can't. And then you have to wait another year. And think about the financial circumstances that a lot of these kids are in. They like a lot of people who come from these backgrounds, they need the money as soon as possible. So it's such a tricky thing because you want to go make the money and get started on your pro career, but you've been building toward fighting in the Olympics still means something.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't mean as much in terms of what your professional value is as it once did, like, in 1976 or 1984, or when Oscar De La Hoya turned pro after winning a gold medal in the 92 Olympics. It's a little different now. The signing bonuses are less, and it means less, unfortunately, but it still means something, especially if you've been building toward it since you were a little kid. So those are the kinds of, Keyshawn Davis and guys like that who were favorites to win gold medals, which not a lot of American fighters have done. I mean, outside of Clarissa Shields, not a lot of American fighters have done actually none have done since Andre Ward did it in 2004. Shakur Stevenson came as close as you could come in 2016. But Americans have not fared well in boxing other than Clarissa Shields in the last few Olympic games. So, but I think we had some kids that were talented enough to win gold medals, and now they're not going to fight in the Olympics, and that kind of stinks.
Yeah, I know. I was up at West Point, and last year we were just about to, I think, a week away from going to the regionals in Connecticut, and then 2 weeks or 3 weeks away from going to the nationals down in Louisiana. We had about a half a dozen or more returning national champions who were seniors. Mm-hmm. There's no fifth year at West Point. You graduate, you're going to work. Mm-hmm. So they kind of got screwed out of defending their national championship titles. And so I saw that impact firsthand. And then it got me to thinking, all these Olympic hopefuls and even kids, just local kids that just sat around for a year, not being able to box. And then maybe most of them couldn't even get to the gym, because the gyms were shut down. So it was pretty. I think because your time stamp in boxing is pretty brief, and there's a kind of a tight window of opportunity. And I think unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong, but I think a lot of fighters missed an opportunity because of the situation that we were faced with. It's very important.
I think you're right. And the other thing too, Mark, is as you've lived in the gyms in Patterson and other places, particularly Patterson, because it's such a rough place. The gym is a safe haven for these kids too.
Right.
So, so what it means to them to have a positive place to go. I mean, from a physical standpoint, from being in shape, which you couldn't be more, you totally understand that more than most people, the value of that. Yeah. But also from a mental standpoint, an emotional standpoint, a lot of these kids don't come from the strongest of family backgrounds or they come from impoverished places. And the gym is really a place that they look forward to going every day to have kind of like a family away from their real family. Right. Absolutely.
Like Joe Greer.
Oh my God. I mean, what Joe did for the Patterson community for decades out of his own pocket. I mean, you lived it. So, so you know how important that is to kids. So even for kids that are not going to fight in the Olympics and are not really going to have professional careers, boxing is a constructive thing for them and a constructive outlet, a place for them to go at the gym that they might not have, the type of place to go that they don't have at home. And to not have had that for a year or so was, we all had everyone had challenges in the pandemic, either from a health standpoint, a mental health standpoint, whatever it might have been. But you feel bad for kids who did not have that outlet that really has such a positive influence on their lives.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, it's interesting for me, Keith, because I'm involved in two sports. One is hockey and one's boxing. And they're two completely different dynamics in terms of demographics, particularly. So hockey now, because it's such an expensive sport, more so than it's ever been. I mean, one hockey stick, a kid could pay $300 for a hockey stick. So you look at that and you say, well, it's really prep school kids, kids who come from either wealth or middle class. Whereas we both know boxing always has been and predominantly been a urban sport. I mean, you do get a couple of anomalies, kids that come from a little bit of background, but for the most part, it's urban. I mean, and if my experience has been every world champion that I've got to know, there's a story behind their life of overcoming hardship. Because as you and I both know, it's not an easy sport, especially at the professional level. When you're getting shoe shine and you're in the corner and you're getting body shots, unless you have that hunger, it's pretty easy to say, I don't like this, I'm out.
Right.
And then the training on top of it, which is brutal. Like we've both been around it where there's, weeks on end of 3 times a week, 10 rounds of sparring, which it can be damaging. And then just making weight and just being in these gyms, I think all the combat sports, whether it's boxing or MMA, because you're the product. There's nobody to pass the puck or the ball to. And you lose, you just got stripped naked in front of everybody on the planet.
Right.
You win, it's fantastic, but it's a totally different environment, I think.
And also, Mark, I mean, it's so hard to make it to the top, to the championship level, even to get into a title fight, to build, and one slight slip up and your career is ruined, right? I mean, you get knocked out on TV or whatever. I mean, you can eventually come back from it, but it really sets you back so far. And it's really hard to make real money in boxing. I mean, you have to be at the top percentile to make real money. And you invest, like you said, so much time and energy, and you have to consider the physical damage that you go and the mental damage too, but the physical damage that goes, because all the real hard work, as you well know, Mark, is done in the gym. And it's like, that's what people don't see. They just see you on fight night show up, and they don't realize a lot of people do, but might not realize all the sacrifices that went into it, not only for you, but for your family and all the people around you. And that's just to get to a fight where you might make 6 figures once, so it's not an easy way to make a living. That's for sure.
Robert Garcia put a YouTube video out. It was really enlightening because He said, okay, so you just got $1 million purse. All right. And he broke it down. Out of that $1 million, you probably, if you're lucky, walk away with 250 grand.
Right.
Federal taxes, state taxes, management, trainer, cut guy, maybe training expenses thrown in.
Yeah.
So, you know, like it sounds like a lot of money, $1 million. I'm not discounting it. It is a lot of money. So it's $250,000. But if that $250,000 has to represent the next 30 years of your life, it's not a lot of money.
Right. And if you lose the fight, I mean,
that's it. You're done.
You know, yeah.
That's your last $1 million paycheck. Yeah, it's not an easy sport. And I think that there's an allure to it because it's still a very, it hasn't changed. One of the things that I always think about and I talk about is there have been changes in every sport other than boxing. Like you look at golf now, I'm a big golf fan. They actually had to lengthen all the courses because the guys hit the ball so far now to make it competitive at their level. Hockey, we have these sticks now that you can balance on a finger. When I played old wooden sticks, you know, we used to have like maybe 2 or 3 guys on a team and say, that guy's got a great shot. Now you got 8-year-old kids that can really shoot the puck because the sticks they're high tech now. So it's changed the game. Yeah, you know, like so football guys are so much bigger. I mean, back in the 70s, if you were 275 pounds, you played the line. 275 pounds, you're not playing the line anymore.
Right.
You know, maybe
you're
too
small.
Too small. So things have changed. Boxing hasn't. It's still 10-ounce gloves or 8-ounce gloves. It's still weight. It's still, you look at fights from Sugar Ray Robinson or even further back, it hasn't changed. And I think, to me, that's the beauty of the sweet science. That's the allure. You know, when we talk about who's the best fighter overall, there is no best fighter overall. There's not a top 10. There's not even a top 100 because it spans so many decades. There's so many great fighters.
Yeah.
You know?
I think the biggest thing, and this is obviously how you make a living, Mark. So I think the biggest thing for boxers is how they train now. I mean, with the implementation of you know, physical trainers, strength and conditioning coaches and things has changed it to some extent. But yeah, I mean, the sport itself is, you know, you're either wearing 10-ounce gloves or 8-ounce gloves and there's nowhere to hide. Right. So from that standpoint, I think that's why people are really attracted to it. And the same goes for MMA, of course, does not have nearly the history in this country that boxing has or anywhere. But that's the allure of it, right? I mean, it's just you and him. There's no one else to blame. Although they do find excuses oftentimes, there's no one else to blame. There's nowhere to hide. And I think that's what attracts people to it to a large extent. And you really show what you're about. I mean, and sometimes it's just not your night and you have to try to recover from that later on. But yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say, though, is that the guys are just in such different shape now than they were. And look, let's be honest, PEDs are a problem in boxing, and it's a problem that has not been policed in a way that it should, because, I mean, this again, and promoters, you know, Lou DiBella and others have said so many times, this is not about hitting a baseball, you know, 40 feet more than you would or whatever. I mean, you're punching someone in the head. You could kill someone. And the people who cheat, I mean, I don't think the deterrents have been enough to really prevent people from doing it. And there's so much money at stake. I think guys are willing to risk whatever potential punishment there could be to try to get ahead. And it's a real rampant problem in this sport. And I hope that it can be curtailed, but I don't know that with all of the advancements in PEDs, the guys are always going to be ahead of the test and they're willing to take the risk. And it's unfortunate because you're playing with someone's life in this sport, and it just shouldn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I've been, as you know, and you knew this guy too very well. I've personally been touched by tragedy with Oscar Diaz.
Yeah,
you know, and I'm not saying there were PEDs involved, but that risk of not coming out of that ring is very real. At the professional level, especially. Where can people find you now, Keith? What's the website and who you're writing for?
Yeah. So I was obviously at the Record and the Herald News for 23 years. So for the last almost 5 years now, I work for BoxingScene.com, which is from a traffic standpoint, the biggest boxing website on the internet. So we're very thankful for that. it's owned by Viacom CBS. So so I work for Viacom CBS, and that's a fantastic company, of course. But so it's boxingscene.com is the name of the website. My Twitter handle is just my last name. So it's at IDEC, IDEC boxing. And I basically only tweet about boxing. I don't not get involved in all the other stuff that'll get you in trouble. So yeah, so it's all boxing basically. And that's pretty much it for me. And I'm on Facebook, obviously not nearly as much as I would like to be, but I'm on there. So just my name, Keith Idec, on Facebook there. So, but yeah, it was good chopping it up with you, Mark. I always,
I really appreciate it, Keith. I'd love to have you back again.
Sure, absolutely, man.
Because this is our wheelhouse. This is what this is, and I think we have a lot of people that are going to appreciate your conversation, hearing what you had to say, and follow you on your website. And we'll catch up again a little bit. We have a lot of great fights coming up, and I appreciate your time.
No, I appreciate you, Mark. It was good to come on. I was the first guest or the second one or something like that. Yeah. Wow, how about that, huh?
Yeah.
How about
that? I actually, well, here's the name. Nathan Parrott.
Of course, yeah. No, I remember when he fought.
It was just like a trial run because this is all new to me. Yeah. I still haven't figured out how to open my phone yet, but
you'll get there.
Yeah, Nathan. Nathan's story, professional hockey player, and then he got a couple pro fights. Is a really good story there. Great kid too. Just fantastic.
I remember.
Young man. But yeah, look forward to having you on again, and I really appreciate your time, Keith.
Look forward to it, Mark. Thanks for having me, man.
All right, man. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right.
Bye.